Hey, you're about to watch a message that has been recorded live at Grace Family Church, South Africa.
At Grace, we say, come as you are. And our mission is to love God, love people, and make a difference. And wherever you're watching this from today, we hope that you're encouraged by the message that you're about to watch up next.
So we're in this series called Rebuild, and it's all about rebuilding our lives, rebuilding our relationships, our habits, our finances, rebuilding our church, and yes, even our nation. And we're looking at the book of Nehemiah, the story of Nehemiah, who rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem and who restored worship to the people of Israel. Now, I know I shared this last week, but I want to say again, I have such an excitement and a sense of anticipation for what I believe God is going to do through this series. Because I really do feel like the time to rebuild is now. And so whatever broken walls you may have in your life right now, I believe God is saying to the wall, it's time to rebuild. Let's begin to restore things, not just to the way they were, but perhaps even better. Amen? So last week, we spoke about this balance between prayer and action. That like Nehemiah, when faced with broken walls in our lives, that we should fall to our knees and pray and then get to our feet and work. We spoke about how prayer and action, they so often work together. We also looked at some of the historical context of what was going on in Nehemiah's day. We tried to imagine ourselves in that situation. That in 586 BC, the city of Jerusalem was destroyed during the siege led by Nebuchadnezzar, and that the people of Israel were taken into exile in Babylon. And then decades later, a few Israelites were actually allowed to return in waves and were attempting to rebuild the city. But because the walls were broken down and the gates were burned, every attempt to restore life was stolen away by thieves and robbers. It would be like having a house with no doors or no windows. In fact, it says that the walls were actually lay in rubble for 140 years. And for 72 of those years, the people tried to rebuild and they failed. Now, I want to kind of press pause there and say, do you know what this feels like? Does anyone know how this feels? Like every time you try to rebuild, something happens. You hit a snag, a bump in the road, or perhaps a major obstacle or setback or loss. As if life is somehow determined to stop you from building or rebuilding your life. It's quite interesting because I feel like, which is often the case, I'm having to live out this series in my own personal life and for us as a church as well. Almost as if this series is in some way prophetic. Last week, Sunday, I came in kind of guns blazing. I preached online and I preached at the Umhlanga campus in the morning. And I had a message, I believe, on my heart for God. But to be honest, the people just kind of looked at me like, like I was crazy, like they'd been forced to come to church by their mom. Luckily, I can't tell online if you're into my message or not, because you can just switch me off or go grab a cup of coffee. But after the second service, I literally went backstage and I said, is this the worst sermon I ever preached? But I know Jess, my wife, she preached at our Cornubia campus, and I know she preached the same message because we used the same notes. And I know that the people loved it there. It was like the best message. So clearly it's all in the delivery. I mean, we know she is the best Basson. That's like a hashtag going around, best Basson. But I, honestly, I share that because I came out of Sunday thinking, sure, that was hard. This is going to be hard, that this idea of rebuilding, and we're going to have to rebuild because things are still not how they used to be, and people are nervous to come back, and the energy in the room. And I thought, we're going to have to rebuild. And I'm up for the challenge, don't get me wrong, but knowing how much work and effort that takes can be overwhelming. Even for Jess and I personally, if I can kind of be vulnerable for a moment, we were discussing this series and we felt like God kind of laid on our heart that we also need to do some rebuilding in our family. That in the past season, we too have kind of got out of sync, out of habit, out of rhythm in our parenting, in some of our own habits, like just on our phones too much, missing each other. And you know this, couples, so often, when we're on our phones, we miss the spontaneous conversations and the moments that I think actually really make marriage so wonderful. So we realize we need to do some rebuilding when it comes to how we resolve conflict, when it comes to how we communicate our love for one another, our love languages, because, Jess and our love languages are so different, and it's so easy for things to get lost in translation. So we decided it's time to rebuild. But I also know rebuilding anything really isn't easy. So maybe you in that same boat, maybe it's the same for you. You know you need to get in shape, but you also know how much effort that's going to take. You know you need to get your finances in order, but you've been living undisciplined or in debt for so long. You know your marriage needs help, but there's just so much water under the bridge. Like the people of Israel looking at the broken walls of Jerusalem, how are we ever going to rebuild? There's so much that is broken and lying in ruin. And so that's the question I want to look at and answer today. The question, what about when? What about when we don't know what to do? What do we do when we don't know what to do? What about when we've prayed, but it seems like our connection to God is this muffled tin can conversation? What about when maybe you've been told to be bold before God, to come into His holy house, His temple, and wrestle things out? But what about when I'm worried about this temple, that this temple feels like it's laid to waste, that the Spirit is in an abandoned space? What about when it isn't easy to bring God the thing that so grieves you, not because you don't want to, but because the hurt feels so huge that you can't even get your fingers around the edges, so how can you pick it up and lift it up to the heavens? What about when you don't know who to trust and your last hope has been crushed and all your prayers have been hushed? Nehemiah, he feels that pain. He feels that burden. And when he hears about the walls, like we read last week, it says he falls to his knees and he weeps. But Nehemiah doesn't stay on his knees. He's so moved by the plight of his people that he doesn't just pray, but he gets up and he acts. And if we move on in the story, because he had favor with the king grants him passage back to Jerusalem. He even gives him an armed escort and letters to the governors and the manager of the king's forest so that they can get timber for building. And then we get to verse 11, and this is where I think we find the answer to what about when. It says this, "So I arrived in Jerusalem. 3 days later, I slipped out during the night, taking only a few others with me. I had not told anyone about the plans God had put in my heart for Jerusalem. We took no pack animals with us except the donkey I was riding. After dark, I went out through the valley gate, past the jackal's gate, and over to the dung gate to inspect the broken walls and the burned gates." What is Nehemiah doing? Well, he's taking inventory. He's going to every section of the wall, and he's actually naming every section, every gate, and he's writing down all the problems, all the issues that need to be fixed, and what they're going to need, what materials they're going to need, what manpower they're going to need to fix it, like a contractor would. He goes on, "Then I went to the fountain gate and then to the king's pool. But my donkey couldn't get up through the rubble, so though it was still dark, I went up through the Kidron Valley instead, inspecting the wall again before I turned back and entered again at the valley gate. The city officials did not know I had been out there or what I was doing, for I had not yet said anything to anyone about my plans." These plans that he was drawing up and compiling and formulating, I hadn't said anything to anyone about these plans. Now, all of this may seem kind of insignificant at first glance, but here's why it's so important. What is clear from this story, and if you read on, is that Nehemiah had a plan. This whole chapter is about him formulating the plan. When the walls were broken and the people weren't sure what to do, Nehemiah came up with a plan. Now, I don't know what challenges you face or where you've already tried and failed. I don't know what steps you'll need to take to get from where you are to where you want to be. But I do know this. You're going to need a plan to get there. Whether it's a desire to get fitter, increase your influence, improve your parenting, read your Bible more, or become a more patient person, all of us need a plan. I wrote this in my notes. The thing about a plan is you need one. A plan is what gets us from where we are to where we want to be, from who we are to who we want to be. It fills the gap between our current reality and our preferred future. In fact, it's been said that a goal without a plan is just a wish. And you know what's so interesting about having a plan or making a plan is that even a bad plan is better than no plan at all. Otto von Bismarck, he was a German statesman, he once remarked, "A bad plan well implemented will yield better results than a good plan that is poorly executed." One of my all-time favorite quotes is by T.E. Lawrence, and he says this: "All men dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of their mind wake in the day to find that it was vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men." I love that. "For they may act their dreams," and women, dangerous men and women, "for they may act their dreams with open eyes to make it possible." And I want to pause here, and I actually want to honor Mark van Straten and Christine, who some of you may not even know. They're the founding pastors of our church. And I want to say, Mark van Straten, he's a dangerous man, because he didn't just dream at night. He woke in the day and made those dreams a reality. And we are here, and I am here in part because of his and Christine's and many others through the years' sacrifices, especially in those early years. Nehemiah had a plan, and that made him a dangerous man to the enemies of God's kingdom. And this is what I want to kind of ask you today. Are you dangerous for the kingdom? Does the enemy shake in his boots when your feet hit the floor in the morning? Or are you just living your life for yourself, going through the motions? All men dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night, they wake to find that it was vanity. Lots of us have dreams. I'm going to start a business. I'm going to write a book. But we never do. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dreams with open eyes to make it possible. And the only way to make it possible is with a plan. Proverbs 21 verse 5 says this: "Good planning and hard work lead to prosperity, but hasty shortcuts lead to poverty." Now, let me just say this before you get the wrong idea. When I talk to people about formulating a plan for your life, they tend to think of kind of, color-coded calendars and detailed spreadsheets, or maybe complicated to-do systems. And then they might even say, "Hey, you know what, Tom, that's great for you, but that doesn't work for me. I'm not wired that way." But systems and processes are not really what I'm talking about. Those are merely the means. What I'm actually trying to call you towards is vision. Nehemiah had a vision to rebuild the walls. Not just to rebuild walls, but because of what rebuilding the walls meant for the people of Israel. And that meant life, it meant security, it meant human flourishing. And so this is about having a vision for your life and pursuing that vision with all that you have. The best definition of vision that I know is that vision is a picture of a preferred future that inspires action. A picture of a preferred future that inspires action. I mean, we all know about this idea of vision in terms of, corporate organizations have to have a vision and they need to, communicate that vision clearly. But what about vision when it comes to your marriage? What about parenting? What about your spiritual life? What about your prayer life? What about becoming less angry? What about improving your sex life? I mean, come on, there's a worthwhile goal. I'm serious. All these things would indeed benefit hugely from an intentional effort or plan, and yet we are reluctant or perhaps unaware to do so. This is the sadness. So many people I speak to, they're kind of passive spectators. They watch events unfold one day at a time. They're reactive rather than proactive. They may plan their careers or the building of a new home or even a holiday, but it never occurs to them to actually plan their life. In fact, most people I know spend more time planning their one-week holiday than identifying what outcomes they want to see in the major areas of their lives. And so as a result, they so easily drift along. Just, to destinations they would not have consciously chosen. Failing health, broken relationships, stalled careers. And this is why I believe so many people end up discouraged or disillusioned, wondering what went wrong because they simply arrived at the wrong destination. So no matter what area of your life you're seeking to improve, Alan Lakin was right when he famously said, failing to plan is planning to fail. Now, I spoke earlier a little bit about Jess and I struggling to find each other in this past season, and I want you to know, do you know what saved us or is saving us? Having a plan. I mean, we've been doing this for a few years now. Perhaps you've heard me speak on this, but every Friday morning in term time, we meet. We meet for what we call a marriage meeting. And it sounds super formal, but kind of hear me out. And this meeting is usually done over breakfast. We meet in a public space. That way we can't yell at each other or things can't get too heated. We have to behave pretty well. But this meeting is not so much about connection and sharing our lives. That's why we have a date night. But rather it's about intentionally reflecting on how we're actually doing as husband and wife and as parents to our boys, Will and Luke. We talk about all things. We talk about how we fight. We talk about how we parent, about our sex life, about our money. We talk about anything that is standing in the way of our preferred future together. Sometimes the meeting, if I'm honest, it lasts 15 minutes and we leave the coffee shop high-fiving each other because of how awesome we are. Other times the meeting lasts 2 hours and I have to apologize many times. I'm joking. Well, sort of. But in reality, the meeting usually lasts about 45 minutes, an hour, and we usually end up digging into some real issues and challenges, and most of the time finding incredibly helpful solutions. I can't tell you how much we need this meeting every week, even when we think we don't. I mean, it prevents things from building up in a relationship. It provides safe space for us to wrestle with problems and find mutual solutions. It allows us to deal with things before they become major issues. But most of all, it helps us to stay true to the vision we have for our marriage. And yes, it's messy and it's sometimes painful, but it is, in my opinion, essential for the long run. So that's what we did. We had our marriage meeting and we came up with a great plan, I think, in this next season. That we're not going to have phones from Friday when we pick up the kids and no social media all the way to Saturday evening. I think that's going to make a huge difference. We decided that we would see a counselor again because there's no shame in getting outside help. Please hear that. We've done this many times before in our marriage for seasons. And I figure, hey, why wait for the car to break down before you take it for a service? And then the third thing we came up with was, well, that's none of your business. But having a clear vision, it helps us develop a clear plan. And for a relationship to succeed, any relationship, you've got to have a plan. As Andy Stanley says, it takes a pulse to fall in love, but it takes a plan to stay in love. It's simply not going to happen on its own. Now, why do I share that with you? I tell you all this so that you may realize that making a plan is something that we do in every area or can do in every area of our lives. Having a vision is not just some business idea. Of course, the million-dollar question is how do we convert our plans into action? How do we actually fulfill the vision? And I want to leave you. Nehemiah gives us 3 great pointers on how we can turn our plans into action. The first is this: set a time. I hope you're writing down. You can write notes. Set a time. Nehemiah 2, verse 6 says, "Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, 'How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?' It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time." Maybe you didn't know this, but Nehemiah was on a schedule. And if we want to achieve our purposes and plans, we have to schedule it. Goal lists or to-do lists are by themselves useless. They're just the first step. At some point, you have to assign them time in your week, in your day, in your calendar. Taking your goals, breaking them down into achievable steps, and actually placing them into your diary, however you do your diary, makes you realistic about what you can actually get done. It allows you to do a task when it's efficient, not just because it's number 4 on the list. Assigning work to times also greatly reduces the urge to procrastinate. There's studies around this because you're no longer deciding whether or not to work during that time. The decision has already been made. Furthermore, a deadline or a target is an essential activating mechanism in the goal-setting process. It actually works in our physiology. You act on a deadline, and then the deadline acts on you. until it's in your calendar, until it's assigned an hour, it's just a list of wishful thinking. I love what Tony Robbins says. He says this: what's talked about is a dream. What's envisioned is exciting. What's planned becomes possible. But what's scheduled is real. You see, this is not about motivation, because motivation will let you down. No one wants to get up early in the morning to run. This is about building systems and habits that bypass the motivation. I love what James Clear says. He says this: you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. And so find a system that works for you and work the system. I do this every night, and again, every Sunday night after church. And again, this is just my system. You can find your own. But I spend about 20 minutes every Sunday night looking at the week ahead and putting in what I call the big rocks, the most important things in my week, whether that's time with the kids, date night, our marriage meeting, big work meetings or work projects, sermon prep, time for prayer and reflection. I put all of those things in first. And then, of course, the rest of the time will just naturally fill up with all the usual suspects: school runs, medical appointments, kids' parties, all the interruptions, all that stuff, grocery shopping. But what I find is that if you do this often enough, you kind of end up with like a template week. And then what you're doing every week is not kind of formulating a whole new structure, but you're just sort of tweaking and adjusting as you go. And like I said, this whole process is done and dusted in no more than 20 minutes. But that 20 minutes of planning is probably the most important 20 minutes of my entire week. In productivity circles, this is what they call sharpening the saw. I think Jess is preaching on that. It comes from Abraham Lincoln's quote: "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I'll spend the first 4 sharpening the saw." And this is actually what Nehemiah was doing when he was inspecting the wall. He was sharpening the saw. Which brings me to point number 2. I hope you're taking notes. The second point is, if we want to see our plans come to fruition, is that we've got to take inventory. Take inventory. Nehemiah surveyed every part of the wall. He took stock. He wrote down the problems. He faced the brutal facts. Then he comes back and he reports. He says, "You know very well what trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and end this disgrace." In other words, he's saying, guys, this is a mess. We got lots of problems. In fact, he calls it a disgrace. And so here's the question for you today. What needs rebuilding in your life? Take stock. What are you sick and tired of? What breaks your heart? What are you saying? Enough is enough. What is God saying to you perhaps in this moment? What have you been putting off for so long that you need to do? What tension do you need to pay attention to? Where do you perhaps need help from someone outside? Nehemiah surveyed the wall, and we will need to do the same. And then finally, verse 18. I love what it says. It says this: "Then I told them," now that he's got this whole plan together, "then I told them about how the gracious hand of God had been on me, about my conversation with the king." And then I love the people's response. They replied at once, "Yes, let's rebuild the wall." And so they began the good work. In the Message version, it says, "We're with you. Let's get started." So they rolled up their sleeves, ready for the good work. And that's my third and final point. Set a time, take inventory, and then finally, roll up your sleeves and get to work. Because this work of rebuilding, it's not going to be easy. It's going to require us to lean in. And it means taking personal responsibility. Nehemiah does this early. We read it last week, Nehemiah 1:6. Nehemiah confesses, says, "I've sinned against you. Yes, even my own family and I have sinned against you." Take personal responsibility. See, at the end of the day, your plan is ultimately your problem. No one else is going to come up with it for you, and most certainly no one else is going to make it happen. In fact, if you don't plan your own path, you're most likely to end up being led down someone else's. If you don't decide what's most important, other people will decide for you. And let me tell you, these days, I think taking personal responsibility is like having a superpower. I mean, we live in a world of blame and shame. But when we blame others, We have no power to change the future. We relinquish power because we allow ourselves to believe the lie that other people and other circumstances have to change for things to get better. And so take personal responsibility. Own your attitude, because you're either going to be the victim of it or the beneficiary of it. Roll up your sleeves and get to work. And so, in closing, I don't know what that work will look like for you. Maybe it's got to do with your actual work. Maybe it's got to do with your kids. Maybe it's got to do with the vision that God has placed in your heart for others. But what I do know is this, is that in all of this, God gives us the will and God gives us the desire to do what He has called us to do. Amen? For 114 years, the walls were broken down. For 72 of those years, they tried to rebuild and they couldn't. And yet, in 52 days, Nehemiah rebuilt the wall. I mean, it's crazy. It defied all the odds. It defied all Nehemiah's enemies because God was on his side. And when God is on your side, nothing is impossible with Him. No enemies formed against us will prosper because greater is He who is in us than he who is in this world. Nehemiah's enemies, they looked at what he was trying to do. They mocked him. They said, what is it that you're trying to do? And I love his answer in verse 20. He says to his enemies, to the opposition, he says, the God of heaven will give us success. We, His servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. The God of heaven will give us success. Nothing is impossible with Him. He defies the odds, even when the world says it's impossible. Think about this. I mean, if you do the research, most people do not go into lions' dens and come out. But with Daniel, God did the impossible. If you were to do a focus group, you will discover that women in their 90s don't have babies. But with Sarah, God made an exception. If you would do a survey regarding whether or not screaming at walls makes walls fall down, but when Joshua instructed Israel to do that with the walls of Jericho, the walls came crumbling down. God did something no one ever dreamed of. Teenagers, all throughout scriptures, teenagers don't defeat giants who've been trained in military warfare their entire life with just a slingshot and a rock. But God was on David's side. And then watch this. Dead men don't go into a grave, stay there 3 days, and then get up early Sunday morning. But with Jesus, God made an exception. And I want to say to you today, the same God that did it for Daniel, that did it for Joshua, that did it for David, that did it for Nehemiah, is the same God that is doing it right now. I've seen you move the mountains, and I believe I'll see you do it again. Amen.